Hello, I'm Mark Baer. You're watching the YourTown television program. My guest, Doug McKnight. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Good to be here.
And we're going to talk today about fake news.
Fake news.
Now, so you've been a journalist for years and years and years. Let's start by going over a little bit about what you do and what you've been.
Okay, I've worked in news for about 50 years in broadcast. I'm a broadcast journalist. Worked in both television and radio. Worked in commercial broadcasting and non-commercial broadcasting. Much of it was in management as an editor, overseeing journalists who went out and did the actual stories. And I still continue to do some stories on the public radio station in Monterey, KAZU.
Of which you've been a fixture at for many years.
Yeah.
So people may not know the face, but they will recognize the voice.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you're teaching a class at OLLI. Let's talk about OLLI just a little bit.
OLLI stands for Osher Lifelong Learning, and it's the extension courses of CSUMB. It's for people 50 and older, and the subjects range about, pick a subject, and there's probably a class on it. A lot of classes on writing, a lot of classes on the arts, a lot of classes on history, and I was asked to do this class on fake news, and to kind of go through it because it's a topic right now.
And so before we started, you said, you volunteered for this, and then you got in the car and you go, well, I don't really know much about this, and now you do.
Well, I know more than I did, and I think the truth is that most people don't know. I mean, fake news is one of those terms that we just apply to things when we know how else to explain it. And I don't know that most people can define what fake news is. So part of it was defining it for myself. What is fake news? And then asking myself, how does it affect us? I mean, how do we as individuals, forget what the social media people are doing or the network or the government, how do we as individuals protect ourselves?
And then, so what have you found?
Well, what I found is this. Years ago when I started out in broadcasting, there was no internet. And the internet came along, and all of a sudden with it came all these wonderful things that we can do. We can look up information, we can shop in our pajamas, we got all of these great things. But with it also came a lot of bad things, the ability of people to steal our identities, to lock up our computers and demand money. And of course, this idea that there's information out there that's not true, that's being peddled. And so there are reasons why individuals accept information. There are psychological reasons, and that's actually helped by the internet because there's so many people that are reached. There was an interesting story that I read the other day about this bank, and the bank is programming its ATMs because they're worried about robberies. People going up to the ATMs and being robbed. And so they program their ATMs to, if you enter your PIN in the reverse, so if your PIN number is 1234, if you enter 4321, the ATM will lock as the money's coming out, so the bank robber can't get it. It will immediately notify the police, and it'll take pictures of the robber in case they, try and run away. Really amazing.
Wow.
And it's not true. That's a bogus story. It's on the internet, but it's not true. And the reason you believe it is that we're conditioned to believe things that we have no opinion on. So our first response to finding information is to believe it, because it's easier to believe than it is to refute. And I guess where people have to go is the ability to be skeptical of things. To say, well, wait a second, where did you hear that? What bank was it? How did they do that? Ask questions about the story. And then determine how those answers justify. What other proof do you have that this exists? I mean, there are other stories. Who's covered it? Where has it appeared? And that's what we're not doing. Add to that the fact that people are predisposed to believe things they already believe. So when you're faced with information and it confirms your belief, you'll believe it. If it challenges your belief, you'll tend to reject it. Not ask the questions I just asked. Where did you hear this? How do you know this? But just reject it on sight because it doesn't agree with what we believe.
When we were in school, we used to study what was the Soviet Union at that time, and we'd talk about the big lie. And you'd read about this stuff in class, but it just seems so foreign. How could they believe that? How could you, if you tell a lie big enough, and audacious enough and tell it often enough, people will believe it. And it just seemed kind of crazy at that time. How could that be? How could these people fall for that? How could they be such, and it could never happen here.
Well, of course, it could happen here.
And they just didn't see the accelerance of the technology. That has to be, the technology is I mean, that's why Facebook and Google and Twitter are sitting in session in Congress right now. So because they have these amplifiers, that's where, and these are the places now people are getting their news that aren't news sites.
Right.
How do you?
Well, that's part of your own responsibility, taking responsibility for the information that you receive. And I'm happy they're doing this with Google and Facebook. But during the 90s, I covered Silicon Valley, and we actually interviewed a bunch of hackers. And what they told us was that it's a giant game, that as soon as the companies figure out a way to prevent them from one entry, they'll find another one, that it's just an ongoing game. So even if Facebook and Google find ways to prevent the ad buys, or they even find a way to stop bots, which they don't know how to do yet, there'll be other ways. So the final defense is you. How do I protect myself from getting false information? And as I said, the other thing is when you believe something, and pick a subject, healthcare, whatever, and you're presented with evidence that goes against what you believe, you'll reject it. And what I'm suggesting to people is be at least open to it. I told this is something about how I look at the truth, and I told this to a friend of mine recently, and their head exploded because this was just all wrong. So at the risk of having heads explode all over, I never look at information as being true or false. I look at information as I'm confident. I'm 90% confident. Years ago, I belonged to an organization called Bench Bar Media, which is judges and lawyers and criminal justice system people, police officers and journalists. And one day a judge stopped me, a Superior Court judge, when I went into the meeting. And he said, "I got to talk to you. Your reporter said something that was absolutely wrong and needs to be corrected." And I said, "What was it?" And he said, "Your reporter said that the court had found the defendant innocent." And I said, well, what do you mean?" He said, "Courts don't find people innocent. They find them not guilty." And I said, "Well, what's the difference?" He said, "We don't know if you're innocent or not. That's something between you and your creator. All the court can establish is there was not enough evidence to reach the level that the law applies to remove a reasonable doubt. It's not any doubt. It's just a reasonable doubt." So the courts look at information in terms of confidence. And that's how I tend to look at it. I'm 90% confident this is true. And what that does is two things. One is it allows me to hold in my head two conflicting views, because I'm never sure which one is right. And two is that it makes me question them and makes me go back and say, why do I believe this is true? What evidence do I have? And I would just submit to people that maybe that's the way they should look at information.
Well, part of this is, as we were talking about, as we grew up, 3 newsmen, 3 channels, very trustworthy people by my lights, and we tended to believe Walter Cronkite. And now that world doesn't exist.
Yeah, you can find whoever you want to agree with. That's true. And so, I mean, it may behoove people to, on occasion, watch those organizations they don't agree with, and just watch it for one night, and get that other information, and at least be open to it.
Yeah.
And if you have to find, not talking points, but real information that refutes it or confirms it in your own mind.
And that's easier to do than ever.
Well, it is, because there are so many outlets that have different perspectives.
Yeah.
I mean, I would, use multiple sources, and not multiple sources that agree with each other necessarily, but multiple sources that have different points of view. And as I said, don't just accept something because you believe. In fact, be most skeptical of those things that confirm what you believe.
But so let's get to the concept of media literacy. And I know that now they're starting to teach it in the schools. And I know that Europe and Eastern Europe has been dealing with an onslaught of these, trying to, affect their elections and their, and sow dissent in their countries. And so they've been on the front lines of this for a long time. And I know that they've been now trying to teach grade school kids, about media literacy. When we grew up, as you were saying, we read books, and we watched TV, but they didn't teach us how to watch TV. They taught us, what was in the books. And we spent more time watching TV than we did reading the book. So we never had the media literacy, but it's more important than ever. And how old should you be to start this, do you think?
I think at any age. I mean, it's not really a conflict of books and media. It's an extension of the same thing. It's critical thinking. But critical thinking as it applies to the internet, which is a different, Marcia McLuhan said, the medium is the message. Different media are different in how they send you information. So be careful about what you read and think about it and be aware. And it's hard to go into all the details here, but in the class we'll take a look at specific things. There was a survey recently, 60% of Americans only read headlines. They never read the story. So the headlines can be really grossly deceptive. I mean, unintentionally so. In fact, I didn't know this, but I was told this years ago. The people who write the headlines are not the people who write the story. And sometimes they don't even talk to each other. So the headline, because it's so short and so condensed, can be really deceptive. So read the story. Be skeptical. Find out who wrote the story. Is it a real person? Is this a real website that you went to? Look at how the website, look for misspellings on the website. Look for obvious things, that awkward wording that maybe it wasn't written in the United States.
What's the difference between an editorial slant and an editorial bias and fake news?
That's a good question. When I went to school, there were three sorts of folders for information. There was hard news. And the objective of news was to observe and report. The reporter was a witness to whatever was going on and was to report. And in fact, the AP handbook, which was sort of the Bible of journalism at the time, said that every statement you made had to be attributed. So you couldn't just make a statement, it had to have an attribution. The second folder was what we call op-ed. It was opinions, it was background, it kind of spanned, but it was someone's opinion. Was in part of it. And the third one was editorial. And editorial had a call for action. What's happened now is all of those got mushed together. If you read a website, you'll see some news stories, you'll see some opinion, and you'll see some editorial. And learn to recognize what they are and then judge them accordingly. If it's opinion, it's opinion. If it's a news story, then there's a different standard for it. And if it's an editorial, there's a different standard yet.
And so I find something like Sinclair Broadcasting to be particularly pernicious because A, that's my bias, but B, on the other hand, that because what Sinclair is doing is they're buying local news stations and they're inserting their national slant, talking points into local news desks, so as if it's coming from the local commentator and the local station, and that's the local idea. What do you think about that?
Well, Sinclair is an interesting case, and for a moment here, let me just make a case. Whether I believe it or not is beside the point. Let me make the other side of that one. Okay. So originally in the Communications Act, there was a requirement that stations be fair. It was called the Fairness Doctrine. Okay. That was taken out of the last Communications Act, and the argument was, this was before the internet, that cable had extended the number of, the reason it was there were a limited number of stations because there were a limited number of frequencies. Now there's cable. Now there's a lot more stations. So you can move around and find different opinions. You don't have to rely on these. Now there's the internet. So the solution for those who are opposed to Sinclair buying a station is don't watch it. Just don't watch it. You know, rely on other sources. The people who will watch it are the people who agree with them. And again, there's an argument. There's an argument that you're making too. Well, wait a second. These are channels that are owned by the government. Why should they go to people with one points of view? My point is make those arguments in your head and realize both sides of them, and then come to your own conclusion.
So before we get out of here, because this is just a very deep topic that's going to take more time than this, but we are both on the community television station board, AMP Media,
Right.
which allows free speech and
Great place to hear all opinions.
and a great place to hear all opinions. And we are having a fundraiser at Bayonet and Black Horse on November 16th at 6 o'clock.
We'll all be
ampmedia.org. I know that both of us be remiss in our responsibilities if we didn't get this in. So that's the AMP Media fundraiser. It's going to be a lot of fun. Find out more information on ampmedia.org. So we've done that. So, and what do you tell? So going back to where we are for just the last few seconds, there is the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. Each has a different slant. CNN, The Hill. There's a few papers of record, and I suggest that people go to, legitimate sources. I mean,
Well, that's one of the questions. One of the things you should consider.
Or are there legitimate sources?
Well, I tend to look at information as a level of confidence. One of the things that determine that confidence is where have I seen this? How often have they been wrong? Have they made mistakes in the past? And how far can I trust it? And then to parse that information within that, I look at the New York Times and I determine this is a news story, this is opinion, this is editorial, and I judge them differently.
Well, anyway, this is Mark Baer. You're watching YourTown Television. My guest, Doug McKnight. We're talking about media literacy, and it's something that we all have to know about a little more, and we all have to check our own biases, and we all have to do some work because the landscape is not as self-obvious as it once was.
For sure.
And thank you.
Thank you.